Everyone, so this is the second video for personality, which is going to focus mostly on um, the Freudian theory of psychosexual stages, and then also some defense mechanisms as well that are Freudian theory. And then we'll also talk about some neo-Freudians or new Freudians, so basically psychologists who believed in some of Freud's theory, but then also kind of put their own spin on it as well. Um, the psychosexual stages, if you remember from the last video, the id, according to Freud, these stages are where the id gets its pleasure from in our childhood, and that he also believed that how the id deals with these stages and like how it goes through each stage um, has an effect on our personality moving forward. Now, again, all of these are entirely unconscious. Remember, the id is entirely in the unconscious. We are not consciously processing any of this stuff. But he believed that these are kind of beneath the surface level as we are children growing up, and that as the id tries to find its kind of pleasure in these stages, that it can have a profound effect on our personality and also on our sexuality and the sexual preferences as well. He also believed that if something happens in these stages and it's unresolved, or it's not, you don't go through the process in a quote unquote normal fashion, then it could have effects like fixation. I'll explain an example of that in a little bit. And then a couple of these other things there that are all in, again, Oedipus complex and identification is um, more kind of beneath the surface um, as we develop. So basically, if you look at this chart, the five stages on the left, according to Freud, are where the id during each stage, where the id gets its pleasure from. So, in other words, when we are, infants and babies, our mouth is how we, if you remember from kind of the sensory motor stage in Piaget's theory, that's the only way that they can kind of interpret the world. So the oral stage that's the pleasure center to the id. So then as we move into the second stage, the anal stage, this is like potty training, again, subconscious. The phallic stage is kind of it's the stage where you kind of discover your, fill in the blank. And then, according to Freud, when we were from about age 6 to puberty, we kind of go dormant with our kind of sexual development. And then once we hit puberty, in that last stage, that's when we become mature in what we desire sexually and what we find sexually attractive or whatever. Now, going back to that fixation element that I talked about last slide. So Freud would say that during any of these stages, if you don't kind of develop normally, that you could develop a fixation, which means that you would subconsciously try to fixate on what you didn't get in that stage as you grow up. So just an example, I'm not saying that this is the best example, but I think I've mentioned in class that I bite my fingernails pretty often, and sometimes I don't even realize I'm doing it. Well, Freud would say that, obviously being the mouth and everything, like Freud would say that that's an oral fixation, and that I am trying to subconsciously return back to that stage because I did not develop normally. It could be a number of things. It could be that I wasn't breastfed or whatever. It can be literally anything that isn't quote unquote natural or normal, and therefore I'm fixated in that stage and I'm trying to return back to it, according to Freud. I don't think that's why I bite my fingernails, but that's kind of his view on it as well. The Oedipus complex that was on the last slide, that's basically whenever he believed it happened in the phallic stage, and that would be when boys develop kind of a subconscious attraction to their mother and hatred towards their dad, again, all being subconscious. Again, this is all very out there, and most people don't really believe it to have a lot of validity nowadays. In fact, a lot of psychoanalytic, psychologists don't really put much stock into this at all. But anyway, so moving on from that. So the next thing is the defense mechanisms. Now, this is based, all these things here, we're going to go over 10 of them. All of these are things that whenever the ego, if you remember from last video, the ego always tries to find a compromise with the id and the superego. I mentioned last video that sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes the ego can't satisfy both, and one kind of wins out over the other. In those instances, if the id or the superego were to win out in a scenario and you can't satisfy both, a lot of times we come up with what's called defense mechanisms, which is us trying to come up with a way to distort reality to keep us from feeling anxious about our choices. I'll explain all the ones we go over in just a minute, but again, it basically is a way that Freud believed we would reduce anxiety or stress by decision making, by coming up with a way to kind of explain away our choices or make an excuse for our choices other than what we actually decided on to begin with. So anyway, so I'm going to apologize in advance. My ugly face is covering up the first example on both these next two slides, but these are just in alphabetical order. Denial is basically when you basically argue against something, because if you basically try to deny that it's happening or exists there, or that it exists, because if you did, that would be anxious or stressful. For example, if you go to the doctor and they tell you, oh, it looks like you may have this medical condition, it's a serious cancer or whatever, just to go to the furthest extreme. But Freud would say that we may not believe that and may seek out an additional opinion, because that to accept that right then is too anxiety inducing. So we find a way to postpone it by seeking another opinion, because that allows us to not be as anxious. So that's denial. Displacement is when you take out your anxiety or your stress on a less threatening target or person. This would be like, rather than getting mad and punching a person, you get mad and slam a door or punch a wall instead of a person. I always say that this is why older siblings, if you've ever lashed out at a younger sibling when you're stressed or angry, it's because they are less threatening. So you take it out on them. Unfortunately, this shows up in like abusive relationships where people will take out their anger on their partner or their spouse or whatever. So that's displacement. Intellectualization is you avoid thinking about the anxiety-inducing thought or situation by focusing on the intellectual rather than the emotional components of something. The best example I can use or the example I usually use in class is a couple of years ago, my wife had a family member pass away, and we were at the funeral, and we went up afterwards and talked to the now widow. And, we told her, we're very sorry for your loss. We're thinking about you, blah, blah, blah. And all she wanted to talk about at that moment was how beautiful she thought the funeral was, how great the church looked, all the flowers, how nice of a service it was, basically focusing on anything other than the actual grief that would be present at that moment. So that's intellectualization. Projection is when you take what you are actually feeling and project it onto someone else. So we all have this friend, I'm sure, where if they're stressed out, you have to be stressed out, or if they're angry, you have to be angry. Like they're projecting how they feel onto others. For another example would be like, let's say you're arguing with somebody and they're just using a bunch of big words you don't recognize, and they're making great arguments, and they seem so smart and you feel so dumb. So you just say, well, you know what? You're stupid. Not really, but that's how you feel. So you project that onto them by saying that. And then rationalization. Oh boy, rationalization. Adolescents are fantastic at this. And I know that because I was an adolescent once and I rationalized some of my dumb decisions when I was that age. But basically, rationalization is when you come up with a logical or rational reason as opposed to the actual reason that you did it. So I know that none of you perfect little angels would ever do any of this, but let's say that you decide one day that you are going to cheat on a test or quiz, and rather than say the real reason why you did it, because you were afraid of making a bad grade, or you're anxious about your GPA overall or whatever, you come up with a rational or logical reason like, well, you know what, Thorpe's a bad teacher, so I had to cheat. I hope that's not true, but to each their own, whatever floats your boat. But or you know what, I didn't learn that much, so I had to work the night before and I couldn't study, so that's why I did. Literally any reason that you rationalize away, that's you're not focusing on the real reason why you did it. So you come up with another logical or rational reason as to why you did it. And that's why. Again, adolescents are you guys are just freaking pros at this. So anyway, okay, reaction formation. This one's a little confusing. This is when you basically take the opposite belief of how you actually feel because the true belief causes you anxiety. For example, this is just one example I read. When I was researching this back when I first started teaching psychology, and it kind of made sense to me. So I'm not saying it's the best one, but let's say that this teenager is struggling with their sexual identity. Let's say they are having urges, maybe homosexual urges or whatever, and because they're struggling with let's say they're in like a conservative family or a religious family, that would be an unacceptable belief. Then rather than face that belief or face those feelings, they project the opposite belief onto others. So maybe they are really lash out towards people who are homosexual, or they lash out towards people who are members of the LGBTQ community or whatever. It could be, I mean, that's just one example. It can be anything. Maybe you struggle with the fact that maybe you feel like you feel like you have feelings of discrimination or prejudice towards a group of people. So you go out of your way to make sure that you don't seem that way. You try to be very inclusive. These are all examples. Again, it's basically just taking on the opposite belief of how you actually feel, because the way you actually feel causes you stress or anxiety. Regression is regressing back to a previous state. So this would be like regressing back into a childlike state. So something really terrible news, you start acting like a child again. You regress back and you throw a temper tantrum or you cry like a baby or whatever. Like that's regression. I want to skip repression because repression and suppression are best explained together. So I'm going to skip that real quick and come back to it. Sublimation, I call this one the Dexter defense mechanism. If any of you have ever watched the TV show Dexter, you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, just to briefly explain that, Dexter is a guy who struggles with sociopathic tendencies, and he has urges to like kill people. But he admits this to his father, who is a police officer, and he basically, rather than turn him in or put him in a mental institution or whatever, he comes up with a way to take those feelings and channel them in a way that is what he believes to be productive to society. For example, so basically, and when he becomes an adult, Dexter takes a job at the Miami Police Department, and he kills people that don't get punished for crimes they actually committed. And he believes that's a good way of doing it. Still terrible, but basically a sublimation is, again, acting out unacceptable things in a way that is socially acceptable. Maybe a less extreme version of that, and it's kind of the Dexter example, is like let's say you're really angry and all you want to do is just like, punch people and hurt people, but you can't do that. That's socially unacceptable. So you go to the gym and you just hit a punching bag for hours on end or whatever or you channel you become an MMA fighter or whatever, like that's just an example of sublimation. So it's taking unacceptable impulses and channeling them in an acceptable way by society. Okay. And then repression and suppression. If you've ever heard of repressed memories, repression is an idea that our subconscious can pull memories into the subconscious and take them out of our awareness because facing them would be extremely anxiety inducing or stressful. Sometimes repressed memories can return. A lot of abuse victims, especially abuse that happened when they were younger, those memories can be repressed, and then something as they get older reminds them of that trauma and it returns to their memory. So repression is the subconscious pulling those memories into them. Suppression is basically you choosing to forget something or you choosing to push something out of your memory because if you faced it, it would be stressful and anxiety inducing. So repression is the subconscious pulling it in or automatically, and then suppression is voluntarily pushing memories away because it would cause you anxiety to face those memories. All right, a couple of neo-Freudians just out. I will talk about Adler and Carl Jung, and then we're done with this video. So Adler is known mostly for his birth order theory. Basically, he was like Freud in that he believed our childhood played a large role in our personality, but he wasn't really big on the whole psychosexual stages idea. So he came up with something called the birth order theory, which he believed that the order in which you were born in your family and how many siblings you have has a profound effect on your personality development. So if you're an older child or a middle child or a younger child or whatever, he believed that there are distinct personality characteristics that show up in those specific examples because of the order in which they were born into a family. He also labeled something called the inferiority complex, and that's when we feel like we're inferior, inadequate to some others, whether it's siblings or friends or whatever, and we try to make up for that through a couple different ways. They compensate it by striving to improve themselves, as it says there at the bottom, or they overcompensate by things there that they feel inferior about. They overcompensate for them to make sure that they don't seem that way in their mind. And then lastly, Carl Jung. Love this meme. But anyway, Carl Jung, he believed in the unconscious mind like Freud, but he also believed that the unconscious wasn't just this reservoir of terrible, messed up things like Freud believed they were. He believed that our subconscious or our unconscious has a couple of different parts. He believed there is a personal unconscious, kind of like Freudian unconscious, where it's specific to the individual and it's made up of things just unique to that person. But then he also believed that there were elements of what he called a collective unconscious, which is where we all kind of have shared experiences and cultural archetypes, if you know what an archetype is from your English classes. In other words, like we have all these things that are collective and similar to all human beings that might show up in our personality. So archetypes like the kind of mothering or fathering figure that's comforts everybody or whatever, or the rebellious person or the villain or the hero or whatever. Like we all have these elements that could show up in our personality, but we don't all necessarily have them in our personality, but they are collective to the entire human experience. Okay. Accidentally went too far there, but anyway, if you have any questions, let me know. But that's it for the second video. And just two more, mostly focusing on a couple other theories that aren't Freudian, and then how we measure our personality, testing, and all that stuff. And we're done. So see you guys soon.